It's time for our big story. This week, Kathy and I are joined by Ken Silva from the BVI Beacon to discuss the 2017 budget. It was one of the most anticipated occurrences for 2017, the budget presentation by Premier and Finance Minister Dr. D. Orlando Smith on Monday, January 16, in which he outlined his administration's plans for this fiscal year. But the question now is, do you have a clearer picture of what has been happening and what will be happening under the NDP administration? On this week's big story, Kathy and I have joining us Ken Silva from the BVI Beacon. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's first dive off with what stood out in the budget. Now, the budget was presented under the theme Charting Our Course, Positioning the Virgin Islands for the Future. A roadmap was provided showing some of the measures that will be taken to diversify the BVI economy, chiefly the creation of an investment and promotions agency to lead this charge. There was also talk of the repositioning of the financial services sector with the aid of a new unit led by a director of financial services, an MOU to help train and mentor more persons to be eligible to work in the financial services sector, as well as a new bank, which is expected to be the Bank of Asia to assist with the correspondent banking challenges. He also spoke of support to be put in place for small and medium-sized enterprises, specifically for startups. And he did shed some light on the business and economic study done for the airport, which persons have been asking about. What are those findings? And also clapped back regarding malicious propaganda, as he put it, regarding whether or not locals will be working on this project. So let's start with you, Ken. What were some of the highlights for you coming out of this presentation?
So you mentioned a lot of the nuts and bolts of what the Premier said, but what stood out to me most is this is the first budget presented under this NDP administration, and probably for many, many years before that, where spending is actually going down. So they're trying to do a little bit of austerity, and I think that's actually a good thing, because you want to do austerity while the economy is growing. When the economy is doing really bad, the basic economic theory in the textbooks is that's when the economy is doing bad, that's when government should step up and spend more to kind of make up for the recession. The economy is growing now, so now it's a time where they should be making budget cuts. We'll see if they actually do that this year, but in theory, I think it's a good idea.
I want to agree a great lot with what Ken said. The fact that the budget has shown a decrease from that of last year says a lot. But again, like Ken said, would this be the actual picture when it comes to the end of the year? And that would be interesting to find out.
What about those new taxes?
Well, as it relates to that, again, we see it's not too many that are going to be on the backs of the people of the British Virgin Islands, but persons are still concerned that this is just a short while after we would have had the imposition of more money as it relates to work permits and these things, and yet there is another tax coming on our backs. This is something that persons would have been rather be without.
Or rather than another tax, it's at least two with one increase
exactly,
and an old fee that was there before.
Yes.
All right, so let's move on now to what are some of those areas that you would have loved to have heard more on, or at least gotten better clarity on. Some figures were provided. We know that the government expects to make $323 million this year, with $277 million going towards recurrent expenditure. There was talk about employment, but employment between 2012 and 2015, which the Premier said went up by 4.4% with a 6.3% increase in earnings, and this is expected to carry over into 2016. We heard about interest costs for this year. $12 million will be going to the reserve fund, but what exactly is the status of that reserve fund at this moment? We heard about the $33 million recurrent surplus, but not a lot of details on what will be done with that surplus. While we did hear some figures about that economic study, again, there are some figures that we could still do more with. There was a lot of talk about percentages, but not detailed figures throughout the presentation. Ken?
Yeah, I'd like to hear a lot more about how exactly they do plan to curtail spending, because we've got a lot of ongoing projects and new projects coming down the pipeline. Still haven't finished the greenhouses, still haven't finished the Pier Park. want to do the airport project, which is one of the biggest projects in history. So how are you going to cut spending when you want to do all these major plans? You also mentioned the reserve fund, and I actually talked to the financial secretary, Neil Smith, the other day, and it turns out that for 2016, they came up a little bit short with the amount of money that they wanted to put in the reserves. They were supposed to put in 15 million, they only put in 10. So they might have to put in a little bit of extra this year. Why does the reserve fund matter? So the reserve fund matters because the government signed an agreement with the UK about 5 years ago called the Protocols for Effective Financial Management. Those protocols says you have to have X amount of money into the reserve fund. We haven't met that threshold. We were supposed to meet it by the end of 2015. Until we do meet that threshold, we're subject to like a number of rules from the UK. So it's kind of an issue of autonomy, having less rule from the UK. If we want to move towards more autonomy, we have to follow these rules.
Okay. As it relates to where we are, where we're going, and where we came from, I think it would have helped a great deal had we some information as to how the spendings for 2016 went, how compared to that of past year. Where are the audits? The audits would have been a great help for persons to get a picture as to how the country is really progressing or not by seeing some figures from an audited report. And I think that is one of the big things. The other thing is the Premier did allude to some investment into the Royal Virgin Islands Police Force to fight crime. I think what was a bit missing there, and I've been listening to others express their concerns, is that there was no strategic definition as to this is actually going to happen or this is just what you project will happen. And that's
Sure.
that's
Can
how
pick
I
up from it there on the issue of crime, because that's one of those issues that a lot of persons across the territory are worried about, not just the state of the economy.
Yeah, so the crime issue is pretty interesting. There has been a recent crime wave in late 2016 and early this year. I think the one positive thing, obviously it's a tragedy, but the one positive thing we could take out of it is the community is starting to stand up
Yes.
and say, hey, this is a real problem. We need to do something. However, I think one of the things that we need to be careful about is implementing things that would permanently change the culture of the BVI. So I've heard a lot about we need to arm all the police, maybe give the police more powers. They could erode, constitutional liberties. Legalize guns, give business owners guns. I'm not going to comment on the merit of any of those proposals, other than to say we should really look at the data and see what crime has been doing over the long run before we make any of those kind of decisions. Unfortunately, the data is kind of sparse, so it's hard to see the long-term trends in over the last 20 years. I think murder rates have risen, but just to throw out one statistic at you, there were 4 murders last year. There were also 4 murders in 1992. The difference is the population last year was double of what it was in 1992, which means the murder rate was actually half last year than it was in 1992. So when you look at certain things, maybe the sky isn't falling.
And to pick up on what you're saying in terms of some of these proposals that are being put forward, coming out of sheer alarmist reaction because persons are terrified by what's happening in such a small population. At this public meeting put on by the police commissioner at the Stickett, Kathy, the police commissioner did make a point to say at the end of the day, while he understands that everyone wants to fix crime, it's not so much arming the police
Exactly.
or arming business operators or security guards, because at the end of the day, it will also make them targets. And
Exactly.
two, if it is that you end up committing a homicide, the police will now have to investigate you. So it's more about changing up this culture, Kathy.
Culture, and not just culture, but one thing that stood out there, what the Commissioner of Police said, is that the Constitution of the Virgin Islands does not provide for business owners or anyone to have firearms. And so it lends a lot to legislative measures being adjusted in order for them to have a comprehensive approach to fighting crime in the Virgin Islands.
And with that comment, we have to leave it right here on the big story for
All right.
today. Thank you very much for joining us, Ken. Thanks again, Kathy.
As
That's it
always.
for the big story. Join us again next week right here on JTV Channel 55.